Thank you for the opportunity to present my team's research on children's activities at recreational beaches and their integration into exposure assessment, which is important for estimating risks from contaminants. This work was led by myself, Helena Gabriel, and my colleagues, Alicia Ferguson, Christina Mena, and Mary Beth Gidley. This project, called Beaches, Beach Exposure and Child Health Study, was funded by the Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative. The focus was to develop new knowledge associated with oil spills. Although the focus of the work was to assess risk to oil, the children's activities documented are independent of contaminant and can be applied to evaluate risks from chemicals and microbes that may be present at the beach. The following flow diagram illustrates the steps associated with risk assessment. Risk assessment begins by identifying the hazard, whether it be oil, harmful algae, or microbial pathogens from sewage. Once a hazard is identified, exposure is to be assessed by understanding how humans come in contact with that hazard. From here, dose can be computed, which is based upon the levels of contaminant in the environment, coupled with information about exposure scenarios. Toxicological information is then used to convert dose to response. From here, risk can be characterized by a probability of disease. If the probabilities are too high, then the risk is to be managed. Much of the work described at the National Beaches Conference focuses on hazard identification, identifying sources and concentrations of contaminants. Here in this presentation, the focus is on a different arm of the risk. The focus of this presentation is on exposure assessment, in particular defining parameters needed to estimate exposure. The objective of this current study is to quantify children's beach-specific exposure factors. Our approach was to quantify macro beach activities by administering a beach use survey, conduct a sand adhesion study to determine how much sand accumulates on children's skin during beach play, and to document children's detailed micro activities by videotaping them during beach play, and then translating the video into quantitative measures that are relevant for computing exposure. Our study was conducted at 4 beaches, 2 in Miami and 2 in Galveston. The beaches were chosen based on characteristics that could potentially influence child beach play, as we wanted to capture the range of beach play behaviors. For example, Crandon Beach is a very wide beach with very shallow water, characterized by sandbars, whereas Haulover Beach was narrower and steeper. Our approach involved, since we are working with human subjects, to obtain written consent, to obtain demographics and macro activities from the beach use survey, to videotape the children's microactivities, and then quantify sand adherence to both hands and bodies. Once the children were recruited, they were asked to come to the beach where the parents signed consent. The children were then weighed and their height was measured. Additional demographics were collected through a demographic survey completed by the parents. Also, as part of the initial check-in, visible abrasions were also documented in terms of the number and location on the body. The beach use survey, in addition to asking questions about demographics, asked questions relevant to exposure assessment, such as the number of times per year the family would visit the beach, typical amount of time spent at the beach, general activities while at the beach, and so on. The survey also asked questions that related to risk perception. In addition to the survey, children would take part in a hand press study where adhesion of sand was controlled for pressure of contact. At the hand press station, the surface area of the children's hands were documented. We also controlled for conditions of the hands and specifically tested the conditions of dry hands, wet hands, and sunscreen hands. When the child proceeded to the press their hands on the sand, their hands would immediately be rinsed in a bag containing particle-free water. The sediment in the bag would then be taken back to the laboratory to measure the weight and the size distribution of the sand accumulated. Each child was videotaped for 1 hour. This work was led by Dr. Alicia Ferguson, an expert on video translation of human activities. The process involved a combination of note-taking and video translation, which documented how many times a child would touch their face or their mouth, amount of time engaged in various speech activities, and where they spent their time, and so on. Once the videotaping was completed, the child would then be taken to a plastic pool where they were rinsed with particle-free water. The sediment water from this pool was then collected and then placed in a plastic bag where it was then transported back to the laboratory for analysis, which included weighing and documenting the grain size distribution. Results show that sand adherence was statistically different between beaches in Miami versus those in Galveston. The beaches in Miami had coarser sand, and as a result, more sand by weight would adhere to the child's skin. The beaches in Galveston had much finer sand, which did not stick as readily. In terms of hand conditions, we found that dry hands and sunscreen hands adhered the same amount of sand. However, statistically, greater amounts of sand adhered to wet hands. In terms of activities at the beach, the children, regardless of age, spent the majority of their time sitting at the beach. Other significant activities included walking, standing, and digging, especially for the older children. Wading and running were also observed, but at lower frequencies. Activities were also subdivided by demographics. For example, by gender, where results indicated that activities between boys and girls were not statistically different. In terms of items touched, video translation documented items touched by the right hand, the left hand, and the mouth. For the right hand, the majority of the time was spent touching nothing, as shown by the red bar, plastic toys, as shown by the green bar, and seawater, as shown by the gray bar. This distribution was observed regardless of the age group evaluated. To provide a sense for the level of detail of data collected, information was generated that documented the contacts with the right hand, left hand, and mouth with various objects such as toys, sand, seawater, food, and drinks by location at the beach. So concurrent information is documented that relates time of contact by body parts, by location, and items touched. In terms of abrasions, we were surprised to find that a large fraction of the children came to the beach with pre-existing abrasions, such as mosquito bites. At the beach, new additional abrasions were acquired, which typically represented a small fraction of the pre-existing abrasions. For more details in terms of the exposure factors we gathered, I refer your attention to the papers we have published as part of Beaches, which are listed here. Although the papers focus on exposures to oil spill chemicals, the data we gathered on macro and micro activities of children's beach play behaviors are applicable to risk assessments, regardless of the contaminant evaluated. In terms of the risk assessment for oil at beaches, our conclusions were that the risks to children are relatively low for chemicals that have known toxicological dose response data. However, there are thousands of chemicals in oil for which no toxicological data are available, especially for oil degradation products commonly found at beaches. As such, we learned that to conduct a true risk assessment, much more work is needed to gather toxicological information for oil spill-related chemicals. I would like to close this presentation by acknowledging our funding agency and the many individuals who participated in the study to make it happen. This project was a joint project between the University of Miami, North Carolina A&T, and the University of Texas School of Public Health. If you have questions, please feel free to send an email. I will also be available during the panel session for the live question and answer period. Thank you.